Hello and welcome to Independent Podcast Service. I'm Paul,
I'm Dave.
and this week we are discussing the episode of Kolchak, the Night Stalker, entitled They Have Been, They Are, They Will Be. This episode originally aired September 27th, 1974. Let us start off with the number one film at the box office, Dave. Any guesses?
And then, uh, damn, there's nothing immediately that comes to mind, especially with the ones that we kind of discussed over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah,
Mm,
so I would be a little surprised if you're familiar with this one. I'll give you a hint. It's a sports movie.
that narrows it down.
Specifically a football movie.
That narrows it down.
Any ideas what it might be?
No, because there are a copious amount of football movies that are forming my brain, and I know none of them.
It's a movie called The Longest Yard.
I wouldn't be surprised, but I think I have it confused with another one.
There was a remake in like 2005 with Adam Sandler and some other people in it.
No, that makes sense. It makes me question what they did with the old version of it.
I think it got
That'd
a
be
re-release around the same time, but yeah, I haven't seen the original, but I've seen the remake, and the remake was I get fine, I guess.
It was a movie about football, and it pretty much stuck to that.
I remember it being kind of funny, but that's also something I saw when I was like 18, maybe. It's been a long time.
The-
So, let us move on to the number one song in America this week.
oh boy. I've been trying, looking into some of the older music at the time. Still, with what was most likely playing, I can't immediately think what would be super popular at the time.
So, the number one song this week was called Rock Me Gently by Andy Kim.
Okay.
I'm not familiar with this, but anyway, let us move on to this episode of Kolchak, the Night Stalker. So, it begins fairly quietly. Lincoln Park Zoo, February 2nd, 5:30 a.m. Shanka, the zoo's prized cheetah, was expecting her morning feeding. It never came. Amidst a whirl of wind-blown straw, Shanka the cheetah races crazily around her cage, but that does not save her. Ron Updike is the temporary sports editor. He's basically become obsessed with memorizing baseball stats, but has forgotten something very important to Carl: World Series tickets, because today is the day of the first game of the World Series, and the first one with the Cubs in it for like a long fucking time.
Yeah.
Ron promised these tickets to Carl after he saved her from a roller derby lady who was very pissed that Ron called her, I believe the term was elephantine.
Mm.
Ron ends up giving over the ticket to Carl, and Vincenzo comes out of his office to tell Carl about a story. Carl tells him that, no, I'm going to the baseball game. Vincenzo drops a few more hints, and Carl gets interested because it's weird, and Carl likes weird stories.
Yeah, one of those particular things that if you essentially heard it, you'd be like, well, that sounds ridiculous, which is completely up Carl's alley.
Exactly. En route, Carl's baseball game is interrupted by his police scanner, a Code 5 Priority 201 in progress. Radine Electronics, Commerce and 24th Street. Detouring, Carl finds police at the scene. Someone inside tripped the alarm. Abruptly, some silent explosive force bursts the wall outward and scatters onlookers in all directions. As the stunned witnesses come in, 4 pallets of lead bars vanish into thin air. Police Captain Quill tells Carl to disappear, and his 2 officers show him how. As Carl is escorted to his car, he passes a group of officials, important people, for Quill salutes them. Carl resumes his trip and this time his poor radio loses the ball game signal to a talk show. A caller is complaining about the street department, who has screwed up his street, Mariposa Way, by leaving tarry sludge all over his lawn. At the zoo, Carl gets a picture of the cage, the bars bent inward. On the floor of the cage is some black sludge. The zoo's veterinarian, Dr. Bess Weinstock, tells him that this is a viscous mass, basically sticky goo, containing a lot of acetane. She believes vandals intended to foul the entire zoo with it, but were scared off. Moving on to the topic of recent animal deaths, Carl learns that they have all died of heart attacks, first a panda, then a leopard, and a panther, and finally a cheetah. Calling the radio show, Carl has no luck learning the location of the irate caller. They claim he never called in, and the vet seems disinterested in the sludgy mess from the cheetah's cage. City Hall is no more forthcoming. They claim no record of road work on Mariposa Way. The ballgame continues as Carl pulls into Mariposa Way. There, Carl finds the caller, Alfred Brindle, and learns that an hour after the call, 4 trucks from the street department pulled up. They tried shovels, chemicals, and finally flamethrowers to remove the stuff. Brindle also shows Carl a broken window belonging to his neighbor, Henry. It seems that last night an intruder kicked in the window and snatched stereo away from Henry while he was listening to it, but never saw who it was. Police found the cabinet and chassis in the alley behind the house, but no trace of the electronics. Carl manages to retrieve a small fragment of the sludge that the street department missed. There we go. Elsewhere, Peter Hudson, out on parole and out of money, endangers the first to improve the second. He snatches a woman's purse and races around the corner into an abandoned building. The basement he picks is full of appliances and electronics. Hudson thinks he's hit the jackpot. However, it turns out that entering this particular building was the last mistake Hudson will ever make, as the whirlwind force sweeps over him. Meanwhile, Carl returns to the zoo, and the vet with his sample. She's uninterested in comparing the two samples, but eventually Carl wins her over. She reveals that they are identical. The stuff is a mix of hydrochloric acid, acetane, and bone marrow. All the animals killed at the zoo had puncture marks at the major bone joints, and all the marrow had been extracted from their bones. Weinstock believes someone ate the bone marrow, then threw up. Back at the INS office, Monique helps Carl develop his pictures, but they don't show much. Convinced they're trash, she tears them up. Carl orders her to reprint them and then heads out to the morgue for a visit with Gordy the Ghoul. Carl wants the autopsy reports on the guard who died at Radine Electronics. He's about to get it after some cash changes hands when walks in Stanley Whittemire, the head coroner, forcing Gordy to backpedal, but the coroner seems happy to give Carl the results. Subject, Lloyd Realm. Male Caucasian, 60 years of age, prior history of myocardial infarction, immediate cause of death, cardiac arrest. Other autopsy findings unremarkable. But Carl is shaking a silent. Gordy is shaking a silent no and showing Carl a cassette. Carl wants to look at the body, but Gordy cuts him off, reminding him that that's not permitted, while secretly passing him the cassette. Sneaking into a nearby room, Carl slips the cassette into his machine. It's a dictated autopsy with the real results. Although the history of cardiac problems was real, the cause of death, heart attack, was bogus, and of particular interest, marrow was extracted from at least some of the guard's bones. Let's just skip through this. Let's just go down to Tony here. Tony is eating an elaborate dinner, a bet payoff from the editor of The Times, when Carl finds him and begins recounting his fantastic tale. It's a toss-up which one kills Tony's appetite, the gruesome deaths or Carl's fantastic assertions. Carl leaves in search of his pictures as some nondescript visitors enter Tony's office. In the records room, Carl discovers that suits have intimidated Monique into surrendering his photos. As a disappointed Carl returns to Tony's office, the suits are leaving. Tony mentions that he doesn't need a UFO story, and that Carl leaps on that, having never mentioned UFOs to Tony, which tells him the suits must have. Carl ends up investigating a group that takes UFO reports. One of their members called in a one-person unverified sighting near Snake Rock. Carl, of course, has to go to investigate and goes to a planetarium. At the planetarium, there's some wind and noise passing Carl. The projector moves. A guard lies dead nearby. His partner summons the police. The dials that control the projector turn without anyone visible touching them. Carl's compass has led him to this spot. Entering the observatory, he tries to strike up a conversation with the guard, whom he believes to be asleep. Then he realizes the truth, and that no one is operating the still-moving projector. Something rises from the console, something that is and isn't there, and yet casts a shadow. The thing moves towards Carl, stirring up a wind, and Carl tries for a picture. As it looms over him, he snaps a shot, and it backs away. The police arrive, and Captain Quill dispatches men to the console to turn on the lights. A disastrous move for the policemen. Carl tries to tell Quill that the light from his camera drove it away. He also shares a theory that it might be here looking at maps. Carl believes that the reason it can't be seen is that it radiates light on a different spectrum, one that the human eye can't perceive. And he further believes that this is why his camera stopped it. The light drove it off. Quill begins to buy this and takes the theory to the government men. Emerging, Kolchak finds the police in disarray. The lights just irritated the thing, and the light truck is now in flames. But if not the light, what? Quill threatens Carl's career, but the police are regrouping and Carl sneaks away in the confusion. Returning to the planetarium, Carl takes a few more photos and realizes that when it recharges, his camera emits a high-pitched whine. He shares his theory with Quill, who isn't interested anymore. Quill warns him he'll be dealt with at a higher level, leaving Carl. Quill drives off. Carl continues to follow his compass. Soon enough, the instrument begins to spin madly, eventually shattering its glass. Wandering nearby, he stumbles upon an alien vehicle, like a metal hut with a latch resting on the ground. It's real, he can touch it, but the door does not yield to his strength. Then the owner returns, whirling the leaves and swirling the air. It advances on Carl, but the whine of his camera seems to drive it off. It enters the vehicle, which noiselessly departs. And Carl's final voiceover: they tried to make a little park out of the woods near Snake Rock, daffodils, tulips, but they couldn't get anything to grow. There is an area shaped like a saucer at the bottom. If you want to see it, you'll have to hurry. Our park commission decided overnight to do extensive reclamation work in that particular spot. They're filling it in with concrete. What happened? That's all a point of view, really. A traveler had a breakdown, stops to fix it, gets a bite to eat. It's happened to all of us. This traveler just happened to be light years off his course instead of miles. As for me, well, I haven't heard from the boys in the sedan yet. So, what do we think of this episode?
Exactly sure of how many other shows were working with these concepts or other things at the time, but it's kind of the typical alien presence movie that you usually sort of see, kind of taking the average angle of the alien isn't specifically malicious, just the case of it has issues it needs to fix, tries to take care of stuff, and it needs to eat. It's just the case of it resulted in a couple of things deaths. But yeah, what can you do?
Yeah, I kind of like that they don't make the alien necessarily, like you said, it's not malicious, it's just trying to get home. And it does, like, kill a few people and animals, but it's not doing it out of, like, a need to, like, terrorize or anything. Like, it's just like, no, I just want to go home.
Aside from that, it was definitely interesting with trying to go with additional concepts within the story. I don't think it's any. I figured it was going to be a bigger part of the story, but it seemed to sort of lose out the main topic of it, especially with Kolchak wanting to see the ball game. Was sort of funny at the start of him getting distracted by the story, still trying to keep tabs on it while he was going along, but just with radio frequencies being affected and other stuff that it just didn't happen, as well as just he did not have a lucky week this week, just with the ball game going south and his favorite team not managing a win. And I can't remember the details, but when he was talking with the coroner of them supposedly having bets and Kolchak just losing out by a number or two.
Yeah, Kolchak, you'll find throughout the series that things rarely go well for him. That's kind of like an overarching theme, is that things rarely turn out well for Carl. Although I do like...
It's not to the extent that he dies.
Well, no, he doesn't die, but rarely do things ever go his way completely. I do like having that through line of having the ball game in the background every so often. I think that's kind of like a fun little detail. And they got like an actual sportscaster to do that. It's Dick Enberg, who's like a super famous like baseball announcer. I think he did baseball. He might have also done football. I don't know. He did a bunch of different sports, probably. Anyway, yeah, I quite enjoyed this episode. I'm assuming you liked it well enough.
Turned out fairly interesting. Still followed along a lot with Kolchak's typical antics, though it does surprise me that he didn't have interactions with people in the sedan that were talking to the police, talking with the other coworkers that he had been dealing with. That it wasn't a case that they went directly to him, but oh man, that would be one heck of a confrontation between the two.
Okay, I wanted to bring up something about this. So I don't know how familiar you are with the name Chris Carter.
Huh?
So in case you don't know, Chris Carter is the guy who created the X-Files.
Mm-hmm.
He was a big fan of Kolchak the Night Stalker. And
Oh.
I've kind of there's so I think the alien thing is really interesting, and also I think it's really interesting that he had Darren McGavin, who plays Carl Kolchak, in like an episode or two of the X Files. So yeah, I like to think that the folks in the sedan that we saw in this were a '70s version of Mulder and Scully.
Hmm.
But yeah, so yeah, this was quite a fun episode. Did you have anything else you wanted to bring up about it?
On whole, it's definitely tricky when you don't exactly have a decent idea of an alien to specifically use, and the better idea is to just either keep it at a point of view perspective and or have other things affected around it. But nevertheless, it was definitely interesting for especially the couple of effects that they did with the explosion, having the couple things fade out of existence, and can't remember if it was more around the spaceship or if it was one or first encounter within the planetarium, but especially with the force back, the amount of uh, distance some people were flung to get the desired effect for it, sort of gave me the thought of, ooh, I hope that wasn't a bad take.
Yeah, there were some here where I'm like, oh, I'm glad I didn't take that bump. Like that looked bad. I do think that not showing the alien is probably a good move because, like, this is '74, so like, what kind of costume would they have been able to come up with? Like, because it would have had to have been somebody in like a suit,
Hmm.
so it probably wouldn't have looked very good.
But again, around those times, it might have been more around in the late 80s into the 90s that, especially with the practical effects that they could do, was definitely interesting to see. Where, despite the fact that nowadays it's much easier to make interesting designs and other things with CG, you lose some of that interaction and whatnot that you get with actual handmade stuff that people can make
Oh,
in those
absolutely.
cases.
The
But
only
again, yeah, for the 70s, it was the cases of did they actually have enough money to kind of get anyone that was decent enough at that? Again, it probably was the safer bet.
this is also only 5 years after like the original Star Trek went off the air. Like, I don't know how good the tech would have been for like making that costume at this point.
Mm.
So, if there's nothing else, next week we'll be discussing the episode called The Vampire.
Because it's Kolchak. It's one of their big three that they usually touch on.
So, this is a sequel to the first movie, The Night Stalker. An overlooked victim of that killer, the Las Vegas vampire, makes her way to Los Angeles and begins killing anew.
Because it's a thing that happens. Vampires need to feed, blood is being the main thing within human bodies.
We're also going to have a guest star in this episode that you will definitely know.
Interesting.
Yes, Mr. Feeney.
Oh my god. Like, possibly at around that time, young Mr. Feeney. Oh, geez.
Yeah, so he would have been. So he's no, he would have been like mid 40s at this point.
Okay, so maybe not as much from when. No, it was probably a bit later with that. Again, it was super popular in the 90s, but I can't specifically remember when they first started filming Boy Meets World with him.
Like 92 ish, 91, something like that.
Okay.
So it's like 15, 20 years after this. It's quite a while.
Hmm.
Anyway, so until next time, I'm Paul.
And I'm Dave.